There's more trout out in the world besides rainbows, browns, brookies, and cutthroat. Golden trout, marble trout, tiger trout, and countless other fish are just out there in a river somewhere waiting for you. Assuming you can go chase these fish, though, there's one question you'll likely get hung up on. Do you need specialized flies to go catch these lesser-known trout? Is there some super secret pattern that you need, but the locals will only share it with you if you buy them the right 12-pack? Sometimes you do need that super secret fly, but for the most part, you can experience all of these incredible trout with relatively simple flies. This week on Untangled, you'll learn more about these cool trout and the flies we recommend to catch them. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Excited to be here to start off the new year with y'all. But this isn't the first episode of Untangled in 2026. If you missed it, on Monday we did drop the first of the second episode, the bonus episode, whatever you want to call it. There will be 2 episodes of Untangled every week now, and we dropped that first one on Monday. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, definitely go listen to it after you listen to this show, of course. But I thought, a lot of us are probably stuck in some colder weather. Maybe you finally have snow where you're living. The Rockies have been weird this winter. The snow has just been all over the place here. And either way, you're probably stuck at home, not fishing as much right now because it's winter, thinking about all those cool fish that are out there in the world, maybe making some plans to go catch them. And I love to do that. I love to just kind of go down that rabbit hole of exploring and learning about all the different trout that are out there. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. We're going to learn about some fish species that maybe you haven't heard of before, and then we will talk about how to catch them, the flies that you need to do that. And I want to start this off with a story. About a decade ago, I was off looking for bull trout. First time I ever went after them, I was with my buddy Blair. Now, Blair used to be a fisheries biologist, so he had a pretty good handle on where the fish should be, and he knew places where some bull trout should be. But that's not a guarantee that they're going to be there. They spend a lot of time migrating to spawning grounds throughout the year. So they might be in rivers or in sections of the river for short periods of time, just depending on where they're moving and where they want to end up to spawn. But I'd always wanted to catch these bull trout. They look beautiful. They're technically a char. They're in the same family as your brook trout, your lake trout, your dolly varden. They're those char. But they're gorgeous. They grow enormous. If you've ever seen any of the Instagram reels of those fish, they're huge. And they're pretty rare, too. They need clean, cold water, so they're often tucked really deep in the backcountry, up in the headwaters of a lot of rivers. So they're generally not easy to access either. And we drove for hours. We're following this one drainage up into the middle of nowhere. We parked the truck. We made camp that night. The next morning we got up and we needed to hike down into the canyon. So we get down into this canyon, and the stream just cuts its way through this canyon floor, winding between some willows and whatnot. Looks perfect. Looks exactly like what I would imagine is bull trout heaven. And we get up to the river. I'm real excited. And the first hole's empty. And the next hole is empty. No fish, nothing. The water's crystal clear. You can see all the way to the bottom. No fish anywhere to be found. And I think it went on like that for about an hour before we finally found a hole with some bull trout stacked in it. And that's kind of when the work actually started, because I really hadn't given my fly selection any thought. I figured, they're just trout. I'm going to be fine. I got my flies. It'll work, right? But it was still really cold early in the morning. Even though it was August, we were up high enough. It was freezing. And it was really early in the day. So again, even with it being August, there weren't really any aquatic insects out and about. There weren't bugs moving, so I didn't have a good idea of what to fish. And then on top of that, I didn't know as much about bull trout back then, to where they really like to eat other fish, little bait fish and whatnot. So streamers tend to be your best bet for these big fish. And that's what I was wanting to catch, is a big fish. So like I normally do, I started overthinking the situation. It worked myself into just not fishing even because I'm so worried about having the right fly on that I couldn't decide what to tie on. And I'm debating it and I'm going back and forth, pros and cons in my head. And I've got 5 flies in one hand and 10 in another, and I can't decide. And I'm just all worked up. Meanwhile, Blair, he's tied on a really big hare's ear. It basically imitates a stonefly nymph at that point, and he'd caught a couple pretty quickly. So I finally settled on a Clouser minnow. I got it deep into one of those pools, and the bull trout just shot out to slam that streamer. They hit it hard. I strip set, and boom, I put a bull trout in the net. My first one ever. It wasn't big. It was probably only about 15 inches, but it was still a fish. It was still my first bully, which was really cool to experience and to see. And at that time, the bull trout was probably the most exotic trout that I've ever caught, and it might still be. I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? But I love telling this story because it illustrates that no matter where you're fishing for trout or any fish in the trout family, so any of the salmonid fish, they're generally going to eat and behave the same way. No matter where you're fishing for them or whether they're technically a trout or not, they're going to act and eat very similar to each other all across the world. I mean, I know folks out in Poland who fish grayling and brown trout out there. They use the same mayflies that I use here in the Rockies. I got into a brown drake catch in Alaska. I think that was 2 summers ago now. I caught a whole bunch of grayling, which are in that salmonid family there with our trout. I caught grayling up 21 inches on that trip, which is a trophy size for that fish. I put Dolly Varden, which is another char, another cousin of the trout. I put those in the net on elk hair caddis before. I've caught rainbows in Alaska from their native range, so not where they've been planted, but where they've been for thousands of years. I caught a really nice rainbow on an elk hair caddis in the middle of Alaska. So the point is, it's not to be like, oh, look at all these fish I've caught. Just the point is, I've had the opportunity to fish a lot of different places for a lot of different trout and trout adjacent species, and we end up overthinking our fly selection all the time. Whether we're in our backyard or we're finally, making that trip to fish for something we've never caught before. Maybe it's cutthroat trout for you or tiger trout or any of the more rare trout species out there. You tend to just overthink things and tend to worry yourself, at least I do, tend to worry myself into knots about it when really fly selection's pretty stinking simple for trout. And I do say that with the caveat of there's always going to be a local pattern or a local take on a classic pattern that works well for various fish because the locals know the fishery, so they're tying flies that are going to closely imitate the bait fish in the water, or maybe their mayflies are a little darker or a little lighter, or maybe they're a little bit bigger or smaller than the standard. So there's always going to be little unique twists on things to add some complexity to it. But using a lot of the same flies that we talk about here on Untangled all the time, you're going to be able to catch a lot of trout on all of their cousins by just knowing what's going on, being able to feel confident in your fly selection. And if you're not familiar with any of those basic flies, like your midges, your mayflies, your caddis, and your stoneflies, and when those are most active throughout the year and when would be the best time to go ahead and fish them, you should go check out our year-round hatch chart. It's a great base to tell you when these hatches are going to happen and when certain bugs are on the menu throughout the whole year so that wherever or whenever you're fishing, you can feel confident in your fly selection and not be like me, worrying that morning on the Bull Trout River and freaking out that, I'm not going to use the right fly, and then worrying myself into not fishing. Yeah, don't be like that. Get the hatch chart, go through it, learn and experience all this stuff for yourself so you feel a lot more confident on the water. It's completely free. There's a link to grab that down in the show notes, or I'll throw a link right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast as well. But let's go ahead and go through. I picked some of the lesser known rare trout species in the world just to give you some info, a little bit of history on them. And then we'll talk about the flies that I would use to catch those fish if I was going to go out on a trip to chase them. So we are going to start out with the tiger trout, and depending on where you're at, you might be like, oh, Durant, that's not a rare fish, but they still aren't as common, even though they're getting stocked in a lot of places, especially here in the West. They're still just not very common, especially out east. But a tiger trout is just a hybrid between a brook trout and a brown trout, and they're really interesting fish. They're very predatory, so they like to eat other fish as much as they can, and they grow very quickly. They're sterile, so all of that energy that would go towards mating instead goes towards growing, so they can get big pretty stinking quickly. And since they're so predatory, they get stocked in a lot of places where there's a bunch of small fish, and biologists want to control the number of small fish in a lake and bring all the fish sizes up. So they'll stock the tigers in there because they'll eat all those small fish, and then they won't overpopulate because they can't breed. They're sterile. Tigers are real gorgeous. They've got that vermiculation that you see on the back of a brown trout, those little worm-like patterns. They've got that over their whole body, but then they get a lot of the brown and orange and a little bit of the red that you see in some brown trout during spawning season. They'll have some of the brown trout spots on their face. They just look all sorts of pretty. They fight pretty hard too, and I've had the luck of catching quite a few tigers in my day. Utah loves its tiger trout, and since that's where I grew up, caught a lot of them. I think my biggest was probably 20 or 22 inches long, but the world record tiger trout is probably going to come out of Utah because there's so many lakes just growing huge ones right now. Now, tigers, they'll generally just hit about anything that's hatching. I've caught them on damselflies. I've caught them on hare's ears. I've caught them on zebra midges and whatnot. But as they get a lot bigger, they really start to prefer streamers that imitate other bait fish, leeches, those bigger ticket meal items. So that's what I would default to if I was going out for tiger trout. Is a lot of leeches, a lot of streamers. That's just when that's their main diet once they get to that bigger size. And I've most commonly caught them in lakes, but they do get stocked in some rivers as well. Now, our next one is going to be the golden trout. These are a pretty cool fish. They're native to California, and they're actually a subspecies of rainbow trout, and they are not the same as the golden or albino rainbow trout that tend to get really popular out in the east, down in the southeast. Those are just a regular rainbow trout that doesn't have the usual colors, just an albino version of the rainbow trout. The golden trout is completely different from those. Even though some folks will call those goldens or golden rainbows, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these rare, pretty gorgeous golden trout that are native to the Kern River area in California. And they're bright yellow and red, these goldens. And honestly, I think they're the prettiest of all the trout that I've ever caught. I've only caught a few of them and nothing over 12 inches. None of the trophies that you see pictures of on Instagram, but they are the prettiest trout that I've ever seen in the wild. They almost don't look real how pretty they are. They're just a fun, unique, interesting fish. They've been stocked in Montana, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. And in the right lakes, they can get over 20 inches long. And those huge ones, those big golden trout, those are honestly some of the most sought after fish in the country. And people tend to keep a really tight lid on spots that grow giant golden trouts. They're usually going to be found in those high elevation lakes, really far off the beaten path. So you end up doing a lot of backpacking for them, a lot of hiking to get to the ones, especially the ones that grow large. You're going to be trekking to catch those bad boys. But once you get up to those lakes, the normal flies that you'd use in the high country, your scuds, your leeches, your midges, chironomids, worms, hoppers, caddis, that's what the goldens are going to eat. They don't make it too difficult on you. They are easier to catch in California if you go to their native rivers and whatnot. You don't have to do as long of a trek for them, but they don't get as big in California in their native range as they do in some of the lakes where they've been stocked outside of that. So that's your golden trout. The next one is going to be our Apache trout. Now, these are one of two trout species that are native to Arizona, and they exist only in literally just a handful of streams way up in the White Mountains in Arizona. And most of their historical native range is actually on White Mountain Apache reservation land. And the tribe there, they've done a great job of working not just to restore these fish, but to open up fishing opportunities for them so folks can actually go catch them. Apaches are related to cutthroat. They look an awful lot like them, but they've got a lot more gold coloration to them than cutthroat do. Cutthroat tend to have a lot of brown in them, maybe some silver if they're in a lake, but the Apaches are much more golden. They've got that bright gold flavor to them. Nice thing about Apaches, yes, they're very rare, but they behave an awful lot like cutthroat, or honestly any trout in the high country that you're going to go catch. They're in the streams up there, and any bug that should be hatching when the high country is open, so your hoppers, your caddis, your mayflies, stoneflies, if you're in the right kind of water for them, they're going to eat those. They make it really easy a lot of the times, but you do have to, you got to go off the beaten path, got to go to the right rivers. I would imagine that you've got to have a reservation fishing license for some of them. I'm not sure. I've never gone after them before. But I know a few folks who have. I can't remember if you need that extra stuff, but they're a simpler fish to get to if you find yourself in Arizona. The next one is going to be our marble trout. Now, marbles are cousins of the brown trout. So they're related to them. And they're native to just a few rivers and drainage basins that dump into the Adriatic over there in Europe. And you'll find them in Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro. That's where you're going to find these fish. They've got that really interesting vermiculation all over their body, very similar to tiger trout. And then they've got a very similar coloration to brown trout, but they don't tend to get the blue that you'll see in some of the brown trout, especially on their gill plates. They'll get that beautiful blue hue sometimes. You're not going to see that on marble trout too much. Now, marble trout are interesting because they tend to be highly piscivorous, which means they want to eat other fish. So they start on that eating other fish really, really early on in their lives. Sculpin patterns, other streamers tend to be a favorite for them over there. But they're also going to eat other flies when they're hatching in any given river. So it really is just about matching the hatch, but then knowing that, yes, you are going after a fish that's a lot more predatory, so streamers are going to be your best bet, and there's a lot of sculpins in those rivers, so some kind of sculpin pattern is going to be the way to go. And it's really fun to me. We're talking about this fish that's native to Slovenia. It's eating sculpin. I think that's awesome because I've got sculpin flies in my box that I use to throw to trout here in the Rockies. You know, even halfway around the world in rivers completely different from what I've got, we're still using the same style of flies. We're still imitating mostly the same food sources. It's really amazing, actually, how much of all of this fly fishing stuff that we talk about here translates to anywhere you're going to find trout. I just think that's really interesting. And then our last of the interesting trout is going to be the Aurora trout. Aurora trout are crazy rare. They're native to only 2 lakes in Canada, and they're actually a unique strain of brook trout. They don't have any spots. They don't have any of that vermiculation, none of that worm-like pattern on them at all, but they've still got the same colors of the brook trout. So a lot of pinks, a lot of reds, some dark greens. That's where you get their name from. Aurora trout, Aurora borealis. They're super pretty. They actually almost went extinct back in the 70s, but they were rescued from some lakes that were turning too acidic. There were some acid rain problems. So they got a bunch, stuck them in hatcheries, raised them in hatcheries until the lakes were suitable for trout again, put them back in there. You can fish for these Aurora trout now, but it's very regulated since they only exist in those 2 lakes. I'm not sure what all permits and stuff that you need, but there's a lot that goes into it to catch those Aurora trout. They do tend to eat the same diet as your brookies. So leeches, scuds, midge larvae, all the flies that you'd expect to fish in ponds for brookies, fish them for Aurora trout as well. And there's a lot more. I could have stuffed so many more fish species on this list. We've got sunapee trout, red band rainbows. We talked more about bull trout. You got orid trout. A lot of these are very similar to the Aurora trout in the fact that they're just subspecies of something else and they only exist in a few different water bodies. You can go all the way down that rabbit hole online if you want. There's tons of interesting stuff you can learn about all of them. But what I hope you really take away from this is we talk about these exotic fish, give you some ideas of how to catch them, and I hope that you're struck by the same thing I was as I was putting the show together this week. Trout are really similar, no matter where you're fishing for them in the world, because we're talking about them eating the same flies, same style that we use over here in America. And to me, it speaks to how you should have confidence if you're traveling to fish, whether that's, going out west. If you live in the East, you're traveling to fish, have confidence in your fly selection, or even on a smaller level, if you're just going to go explore a river that you've never fished before, that's not too far from your house, but you start to worry about, are the same flies going to work? Are they not? Remember, we've talked about how all these different trout all around the globe are still eating mostly the same diet. You're going to be fine. Have more confidence in your fly selection process. Don't end up like me, where you worry yourself into not even fishing, and certainly don't feel like you need a whole new fly box full of these special patterns tied with super rare materials. You don't need any of that stuff. Just the basic flies we talk about all the time are going to do the trick for you in a lot of different places. So hopefully that's what y'all took from this. But we are going to end this part of the show this week. Thank you guys. If you've got any more insights or info or questions about these rare trout, definitely drop those down in the comments. I'd love to chat some more about these fish. They're really fun to talk about. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion of this week's show, because every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show answering questions from listeners and viewers just like you. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there is a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Matt from Idaho has our first question, writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. A quick thank you for everything you have been sharing regarding fly fishing on your podcast and YouTube pages. The info has been invaluable for a new fly fisher. My question revolves around extra spools for reels and rig setups. What are the pros and cons? What experience have you had in utilizing them? And what recommendations do you have for establishing a good setup for different situations? Thanks." Matt, really good question here. Thanks. And thank you for the kind words about the show. I really appreciate it. I used to be all sorts of interested in every conceivable rig. I wanted it covered. I wanted to never have to worry about having the right line or reel for any situation. And it was to the point where I had reels rigged up with intermediate sink line, sink tip lines, full sink lines, short and slow sink tip lines, one reel with line designed just for throwing big flies and another with line for dry flies, and it got overwhelming really quickly. It was kind of cool to have all that stuff, but I hardly ever used all those setups. I really just rarely actually took them out and used them all day long. Most of my fly fishing is pretty simple. I'm fishing dry dropper rigs, dry fly rigs, nymph rigs, and streamer rigs. So to do all that, you don't need a whole ton of different line setups, especially since I don't tight line nymph. So I don't need a whole different setup for that. My current stable is a lot more in control now, thank goodness. And my wallet is definitely thankful for that right now. But I currently just have one reel for streamer fishing. It's got a sink tip line on it that goes on my 6-way rods. I don't have any full sink line anymore. I don't fish lakes enough to justify having it anymore. That sink tip is perfect for me. I've got another 6-weight reel that's got a half size heavy line on it, so a little bit heavier line. And the taper on that line is built for throwing big nymphs, big hopper dropper rigs, stuff like that. So I've got that 6-weight rigged up. It helps in the wind as well. Then I've got a 5-weight reel with just all around line on it that I use for everything else. But then I do have another 5-weight reel with silk line spooled up for my bamboo rods. another 5-weight reel with true to weight line for dry fly fishing. And then I do have true to weight lines for dry flies on my 3-weights and my 4-weights as well. But I don't really, consider those extra. That's just the best line for those rods. So even though I still have a fair amount of line and reel choices on my hands, they all serve a defined purpose, and I use them pretty consistently, even if I still reach for that all-around 5-weight and the slightly heavy 6-weight more than anything else. The sink tip on the 6-weight I do use a lot this time of year when I'm fishing streamers. But, and even all those fancy dry fly lines I have, they're great. It's nice to have them, but I rarely take them out because I rarely go out for a day of only fishing dry flies. Just the hatch usually doesn't last all day. So before or after the hatch, I'll be fishing dry droppers or I'll be fishing nymphs trying to find the fish. Sometimes I will. There's some rivers we'll go to where the fish do rise all day and I go in prepared to do that. But a lot of the times I reach for that all around 5-weight line because it is so dependable. It is so solid. And it'll work for dry flies in a pinch. It's rare that I go out and only bring a dry fly focused rig just because I like to have some versatility. I like to be able to do dry dropper rig if the situation calls for it, or, heaven forbid, put on a nymph rig if the situation calls for it as well. So I generally opt for my all around 5-weight lines. Sometimes my 6 as well, just depending on the time of year. If I'm going to go hopper dropper, 6-weight can give me a little bit more control over that. But that's generally how I roll with it. It's kind of like, all these wing restaurants, they've got all this crazy menu of all these sauces and flavors, and they're cool. I enjoy being able to try them, but I always come back to Classic Buffalo at the end of the day because it's just it's so good. It's too good to pass up. So I return to it as often as I can. It's that same situation. So the pros, I think, are pretty obvious here. You asked about pros and cons. You've got a line and a reel that are dialed in for specific fishing situations. And that's nice to have because you've got it. It's ready to go at a moment's notice. But the con is that it does cost quite a bit of money to set that up. Even if you get one of those reels that comes with 3 spools, you still need backing and line for each spool. And the line's not cheap these days, even if you're not buying the $120, $150 fly lines, which you definitely don't have to at all. But even if you're not buying those, you're still probably spending, $50 to $80 on a line, I would imagine, these days for a quality one. And, that's $150 after you paid for the reel just to get the line on it. So there is the cost aspect of it. And then I don't use all those rigs anymore enough to justify their cost. That's why I don't have them set up anymore. I've literally got in my desk here in the podcast studio, I've got a whole drawer that's just fly line that I don't remember the last time I put any of those on a reel because I just never use them anymore. So, my 2 cents on this would be only splurge on the extra spools, extra reels and lines if you're going to be using that setup frequently enough to justify it to where you don't want to have to switch lines between reels and deal with the headache of untangling all those lines and whatnot. If you're going to use that stuff consistently enough to justify it, then go ahead and do it. But like, for example, I could probably get away without my 6-weight floating line. And I could probably just use my 5-weight for everything except streamers on sink tip lines. But even if I pared my gear down to that point, I'd still want a 6-weight sink tip at a bare minimum because I fish streamers enough that it's a valuable piece of gear for me. But if you never fish streamers, you don't have an interest in doing it, you don't really want to try it, then setting up a rig for that just in case is going to be a waste of money and time. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'd only rig up for the stuff that you're going to use consistently. So hopefully that clears up your question for you. I appreciate it. Thanks for sending it in. Jonah from Alberta has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, I bought an Orvis Clearwater over the summer, and I always have a problem with getting the loop-to-loop fly line to lead or not through my guides. My past rods didn't have this problem. I usually use longer leaders, so the knot to knot has to go through my guides to net the fish. Do you have any tips?" Well, Jonah, first off, you should have bought a fly flinger because the fly flinger blows the clear water completely out of the water. Sorry, it was a dad joke. I couldn't resist that there. I do like the fly flinger more than the clear water, though, and I'm not just saying that. I do like it better than the clear water. It's just a little more responsive, a little bit more lively in hand, I think. But anyways, to your point, this is a pretty common problem, that loop-to-loop connection sticking on guides when you're reeling in, or if you got a strip line in, or even just getting line out of your rod. That does hang up quite a bit. And it's a bigger problem on different rods depending on the size of the guides that they use, because that does tend to get them hung up sometimes. But I've really only noticed that with older rods that used a lot smaller guides than what we use these days. I would wonder if maybe you switched out leaders, switched out line, and that loop-to-loop connection is just seated a little differently than the last one was on your other rods. That would kind of be my first take, is that it's not necessarily that connection itself, but it's maybe the most recent iteration of it. Maybe you didn't get it as flat or as streamlined as you could have. So I'd take a look at that first. But if you do have this problem and it bothers you, like it bothers me, then I would just go ahead, cut the loop off your fly line. You're not going to harm your fly line. If you cut the loop off, it will be fine. Just cut that loop off and then learn how to do a nail knot and put your leader onto your fly line that way. The nail knot is very slim. It's strong. There's only one knot instead of on a loop-to-loop knot. You've got two perfection loops plus the loop where they join. So you've got three places for that line to hang up in your rod guides. So you go down to a nail knot, you've got one spot. It's really streamlined. And nail knots are really simple to tie. They're not hard. I remember when I first looked into tying them, folks were like, oh, those are really tough. You're going to have a hard time. And I'm like, no, it really wasn't that bad. So don't let any attitudes out there about knots worry you. They're simple. And the VFC nippers that we sell in our starter packs here, they even come with a nail knot tool on them. And you can find those nail knot tools everywhere. They make tying it super simple. But I actually learned how to tie the nail knot without the tool. And I've gotten pretty good at it over the years, where I can just whip it up. It's really not hard to do. So if you don't want to get like another piece of gear, you don't need the nail knot tool. You can do it without that. But that would be my 2 cents, is maybe just check that knot first just to see how it's seated. Maybe it's a little bit different than how it was on your previous rods. And then from there, I just go ahead, cut your loop off, nail knot it, and you will not look back. I promise. It's like the first time you tried Diet Coke after a lifetime of Coke Zero. Oh man, what was I missing? This is great. Yeah, that's how it's going to be. So I appreciate it, Jonah. Thanks for sending the question in. Andras from Slovenia has our next question, writes in and says, hi, Spencer. I love your weekly podcast. I learn a ton from you and the whole VFC channel. My question is about streamer fishing, more precisely about hook gaps. When I fish streamers, I usually use around a 3-inch long streamer with a jig head and a 0.5-inch hook gap. I've had success with it. In fact, my PB marble trout was caught on a streamer like this. But it happens quite often that the fish come off. I do a strip set and keep the line tight, but they still manage to shake free. A good fisherman friend of mine told me that the hook gap should be bigger, and he gave me a 5.5-inch streamer with a 0.8-inch large hook gap, which I haven't had the chance to try yet. The hook placement is always in the middle of the streamer, so I'm wondering what you were thinking about adding a stinger hook in the tail. Sometimes it feels like the fish bite the tail and don't reach the main hook. Keep in mind that on the Sosha River, we are only allowed to use one single barbless hook, so it is down to the main hook or the stinger hook. So to make my rambling short, stinger hooks, yes or no, and what about hook gaps, bigger or smaller? Or does it depend on the situation? Thanks in advance for answering, and there's an open invitation for you and Alex to come to Slovenia and try to get a marble trout on a dry fly. Andras, thank you, man. Appreciate hearing from you. Love seeing all your stuff in the school group, by the way. You're a great contributor there, so thank you. Our school group, for those who don't know, it's a great place to go hang out, learn from other anglers, meet people, see fish and flies from all over the world, like from Andras here. it's a great place to hang out. There's a link to join school down in the show notes if you're interested. But let's go ahead and dive into this question. First off, it's hard for me to wrap my head around this whole one hook only rule on any of your fly fishing rigs out there, because I always use 2 at a minimum, unless it's a great dry fly hatch. And I use 3 flies a lot more than people realize, I think. It's just interesting how different the regulations are over there. But for those who don't know, hook gap just refers to the space between the hook point, or the sharp part of the hook, and the shank, which is the long part of the hook where you actually wrap all the fly materials on there. So hooks with large hook gaps, they've got a ton of space between the hook and the shank. And then hooks with small hook gaps have a little bit of space between the hook point and the shank. Now, personally, I tie a lot of my streamers on short shanked wide gap hooks that were actually originally intended for bass flies. But they work really great for streamers as well. And I like using these hooks because they position the hook almost in the middle of the streamer. So when my fly gets rammed by the fish, I think having the hook right in the middle instead of closer up to the eye of the hook or further back, I feel like my hookup rate's a little bit better with that. And especially since I like to tie a lot of streamers with bunny fur and marabou feathers, there's usually a lot of junk on my streamers. That wider hook gap sticks out plenty far from the material that I'm using. So I don't usually have to worry too much about the hook point not having good purchase in the fish when I go to strip set, because the hook is sticking out far enough. So with hook gaps being said, the idea is that a wider hook gap is going to give you a little bit more room to really set that hook, because the fish come and they only tag part of the streamer. We'll get to that in a minute. That bigger hook's just going to give you a little bit more room, a little bit more purchase, a little bit more real estate to work with when you go to strip set that hook in. And especially if you use streamers that have a lot of material on them, that hook's going to stick out further from the material. And the idea being that, it's going to be a bigger hook's going to catch fish more effectively than a smaller hook, essentially, is what it boils down to. Now, with all of that in mind, does the hook gap actually make a difference? Does it matter? I really don't know. I don't have an answer for you on that part, unfortunately. I've fished a lot of streamers for a lot of years, just tied on regular hooks, so standard hook gaps and whatnot, just those longer shanks, standard gaps, and I did just fine with those. I feel like my short shank, wide gap hooks work well, but I don't know if it's better than my other ones, and I also don't have any empirical data I can use to back that up. It's just what I feel. So I don't think the hook gap makes too much of a difference, but I wouldn't hesitate to play around with it either. A bigger hook gap is not going to harm you. So I wouldn't hesitate to try out those hooks from your friend who gave you the bigger hooks there. Now, as far as the stinger hook question goes, I used to tie a lot of my streamers with stinger hooks on them as well. So they were articulated streamers. They'd have 2 hooks in them. And the hookup ratio on flies like that is a lot higher, but 2 hooks are a lot harder on the fish and probably a much bigger pain in the butt to remove when you're pulling the fly out of the fish's mouth. And since that's not possible on your river anyways, I know that's a moot point. Just wanted to address that for everybody listening. But if I was in your situation, I probably wouldn't worry about tying the stinger hook in for a couple of reasons. Okay, first off, stinger hooks can pull loose or break or snag on junk in the river. And I'd really hate to lose a big fish. And I'd hate for you, Andras, to lose a big fish because the stinger hook wasn't tied securely enough. I might be worrying about that too much, but it's a legitimate worry I have. So it's entirely possible I'm blowing it out of proportion, but it is something I'm like, I don't know. I get kind of nervous about. So first reason I wouldn't do it is for that. Second reason, when a lot of times when fish come to eat your streamer, they're just going to nibble at the tail to start. They're just going to hit the back of the fish to start. And this is what's called a short strike. Okay, when they come up, they don't eat the whole fly at once. They just hit part of it. And usually it is the tail. What they're doing at that point is they're actually trying to shock or stun the streamer because it looks like a bait fish. So they're trying to shock or stun it into not moving. So they'll hit it once really hard, and then they'll leave for a sec, and then they'll come back around once the fly has been stunned, and that's when they're going to open up and swallow it, because then the fish know, okay, hey, I stunned it. I'm going to go ahead and eat it. I'm not exerting more energy than I need to chasing it. I've got it ready to go, basically. And that's when you're usually going to get a really good hook set, because they'll try to eat it all at once at that point. So what might be happening is you're going to feel these short strikes, and you might feel like you're missing fish. And sometimes that is just how they hit them. Some days they just come out and they just nibble at the end of the fly all day long. And there's really not much you can do when that's what they're doing. But often they're going to come out, they're going to hit that fly once, they're going to wait for it to stop moving, and then they're going to come in for the kill shot. And I've actually had to force myself to wait and to stop my streamers moving when I get that short strike, when they come in and they don't give me enough to let me, get a good strip set in. They hit it. I'm like, oh, okay. I let the streamer die, the fish come back and they eat it. I've lost count of how many times that happens, because it's a very effective way to fish them. So with that in mind, if I could only use one hook in my streamers, I'd probably just keep the one that's already there instead of adding a stinger, because they will come around, they will hit it again. Now, if the fish are consistently short striking, like we talked about, or they're not coming back to hit your fly at all after the initial strike, then yeah, I think it'd be a great idea to mess around with the stinger hook instead. So hopefully, that was a great question, Andras. Thank you. And hopefully that answers it for you. If you got any more questions, tips, if anybody has questions or tips that could help them out, drop those down in the comments. But we're going to go ahead and move into the Live Real Life moment for this week's show. And every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and picture from folks out there in the VFC audience who are living real life. That's what VFC and Untangled exists for, is to help y'all get out there, have these adventures, have these unforgettable moments. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes, or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment comes to us from Cody, who writes in and says, so a few months back, our family was hit with the terrible news that my youngest brother had passed away unexpectedly. I was completely devastated and didn't really know how to handle it. I'm pretty new to fly fishing, but it was the only thing I could think to do to try and get my mind right. I've been out with friends a few times and caught a few fish with our guidance. However, this was my first solo mission. I was making my way up my local river on a beautiful summer morning. As I was wading through the water, a huge eagle glided right above my head going upriver. Assuming we had the same thing on our minds, it made me feel like I wasn't really alone out on the water. Shortly after I saw the bird, I found a promising-looking hole and decided to give it a shot. I sent my fly right over the hole, trying to figure out my strategy for this spot, when a pretty decent brown smashed my hopper. It was incredible. Heart racing and yelling tips to myself, I managed to get him in the net. I'm pretty sure it was the first time since my brother passing that I truly felt happy again. After I gave the little dude a breather and took one myself, I took a closer look at him. He looked great, but when I turned him over, I noticed that he looked as if he had a run-in with our eagle friend from a few minutes earlier. One of his eyes was pretty much blinded, and he had a villainous scar running down his face. I thanked him for the good times and sent him on his way. About a week later, I brought my younger brother with me to try and help him get his mind off things. We went to the same stretch of river, and I was determined to get him his first fish on a fly. We fished the river for a ways without success. We got to the exact hole I ended at last time, and I had him give it a try. He sent a few casts out, and with some mending tips, he had a fish come up and gulp his dry fly. After he got him in the net and we stopped laughing from the adrenaline, we took a look at the fish. I kind of just stood there in silent shock as he turned to show me that this fish was blind in his right eye and had a big scar on his face. It was undoubtedly the same exact fish I had caught a week before. Call it what you will, divine intervention, a message from the universe, who really knows? But it seemed to be exactly what we both needed, just a small break from the hard world we can find ourselves in. a reminder that things will get better. I truly hope everyone can experience this kind of joy in their lives with the ones they love. Keep up the good work. My brother and I love the podcast, and I've learned a bunch. Well, Cody, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And I mean, you said everything there is to say. I'm not going to try and add on to it because there's nothing else I can say other than thank you. And I'm very sorry for your loss, and thank you again. That was a great story, great experience that you shared with us. And with that, folks, we're going to go ahead and wrap the show up this week. Appreciate y'all being here and listening to the entire thing. That means more to us than you can know. If you want to help us out even more, want to help Untangled take over the world, which, I mean, that's our goal. Let's be honest. If you can rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, that's going to help us reach more folks, help them live real life, which is the whole reason we're here doing this. And speaking of that, go find some time in the water if it ain't too cold. Maybe tie some flies, maybe daydream about some exotic trout. Have some fun. And until next week, live real life.